My daughter looked at me and said very gently, "Let me handle these things for you, Mom. You're old now." Some wounds don't come from harsh words. They come from sentences that sound like care, but somehow make you feel smaller without you even realizing it. If it were you, what would you do? React immediately to prove you're still fine, or stay silent to keep a blood relationship at peace? I didn't react the way people might expect, and it was that silence that made me see things I had never dared to face before. If you've ever felt pushed to the margins within your own family, this story might be for you. Stay with me. I want to tell it from the beginning. I still remember that afternoon clearly, not because anything special happened, but because everything felt so familiar. The kind of familiarity that makes you believe nothing could possibly go wrong. It was a year-end family gathering. The air was slightly chilly, and the sun set earlier than usual. I arrived at my daughter's house just as the clock turned 4. The house wasn't large, but it was tidy. The familiar smell of food drifted out from the kitchen, the kind of smell that instantly soothes your heart. For years now, every time I stepped into my child's home, I felt the same way, that I was in a safe place. My daughter opened the door. She smiled, hugged me, and quickly took the bag from my hands. I remember thinking that she seemed more attentive lately, not the kind of attention that makes you uncomfortable, just more mindful than usual. She asked if I was tired, if I needed to rest for a bit. I told her it was fine. I was doing okay. I sat down in the familiar chair in the living room. Everything looked just the same. The old rug, the wooden table with a chipped corner, the family photos hanging on the wall. I looked at those photos and felt my heart settle. Family, to me, had always been a refuge, a place where you didn't need to be on guard. My daughter brought me a cup of warm water. She set it in front of me and reminded me to drink it while it was still hot. Her voice was gentle, her eyes brighter than usual. I nodded and picked up the cup, steam rising softly. There was nothing suspicious, at least that's what I thought at the time. And yet, for reasons I couldn't explain, in that very brief moment I felt myself slow down, not out of fear and not out of suspicion. Just a vague sensation, like something inside me had shifted slightly, even though everything around me seemed calm. I told myself I was overthinking it. At my age, people tend to do that, and I believed it. I believed that family was still the place where I could put my complete trust, just as I had for so many years. After that afternoon, I went home as usual. Everything followed its familiar rhythm. I hung my coat on the hook, boiled some water, and sat down in the chair by the window. Outside, it was fully dark. Streetlights came on one by one, casting a soft yellow glow over the dew-damp road. I held the cup in my hands but didn't drink right away. Not because it was too hot, but because something inside me hadn't settled. The feeling was unclear. It didn't form into words or concrete thoughts. It was just a small, hollow space where the familiar sense of reassurance was no longer complete. I questioned myself. Was I being overly sensitive? At this age, don't people tend to dwell on things that don't really matter? I'd heard that many times before. That's when you get older, you think too much, worry too far ahead. Maybe my children were simply being a bit more caring, and I was the one reading too much into it. I didn't want to doubt my child. The thought itself made me tired. For so many years, I had believed that family was a place where you didn't need to be defensive. I had lived with that belief for so long that it became part of how I saw everything. Doubting my own child felt heavy. I didn't want to carry that thought in my heart. And yet, precisely because I didn't want to doubt, I found myself paying closer attention. The caring questions, the reminders about my health. The way my daughter looked at me was a bit longer than usual, as if waiting for me to do something. All of it was very subtle. So subtle that if I told someone about it, they'd probably see nothing wrong. I sat there for a long time. I didn't turn on the TV. I didn't play the radio. I just sat and let the thoughts pass without holding on to them. I remembered someone once telling me that when your heart isn't settled, it's best not to rush to conclusions. Just let things stay still for a while, and clarity will come on its own. That night, I went to bed later than usual. Before turning off the lights, I stood in the living room for a moment, looking around my familiar home. I didn't feel afraid. I didn't feel angry. I only felt that I was standing before something I couldn't yet name. And in that moment, I understood one thing. I wasn't foolish. I had simply trusted, deeply, and for a very long time. The days that followed passed rather slowly. Nothing happened that was clear enough to be called unusual, yet the sense of ease I once had was gone. Everything felt like excellent dust, little by minor settling in my mind, not enough to cause alarm, but enough to cloud the clarity of my heart. My daughter called more often. The content of the calls was much the same, asking whether I had eaten, whether I slept well, and whether I remembered to take my medication on time. The questions repeated so often that I could almost predict what she would say next. I answered as usual with the same familiar responses. I wasn't annoyed. I simply began to take note. Sometimes, in the middle of the conversation, she would bring up my health again. She would mention that at this age, people tend to forget things, that some matters are better left to others so the mind feels lighter. Her tone was still gentle, still carried the air of concern. But I noticed that every time I said I could still take care of myself, her voice slowed by a beat, as if she wasn't entirely reassured by my answer. I didn't react. I didn't argue. I didn't explain further. I just listened and nodded. I understood that when my thoughts were still unsettled, any reaction could be misguided. I had lived long enough to know that not everything needs an immediate response. Some questions only need to be set aside and waited on. One morning, while tidying a drawer in my study, I came across a stack of old papers, familiar documents mixed with a few pages I couldn't recall ever reading carefully. I didn't rush to look at them. I stacked them neatly and set them aside. At that moment, I wasn't ready to face them, not out of fear, but because I wanted my mind to be calm first. I continued with my daily routines as usual: grocery shopping, cooking, watering the plants on the porch, small tasks that helped keep my rhythm steady. Whenever my thoughts wavered, I reminded myself to slow down. I believed that if I didn't rush, the truth wouldn't need to be dragged into the light. It would find its own way to appear, in its own time. At some point, I realized those small details no longer stood alone. They began to align like pieces of a puzzle. Not yet a clear picture, but enough for me to understand that a larger question was taking shape. And I knew that when that question was fully formed, I wouldn't need to search for the answer. It would come to me on its own. I went back to that stack of papers on a quiet afternoon. It wasn't raining and the sun wasn't harsh. Everything was so still that I could hear the wall clock ticking, one beat at a time. I pulled open the drawer, placed the file on the table, and sat down. There was no sense of suspense, just a slow, deliberate focus, like preparing to read an old letter. At first, I thought they were just routine administrative documents, the kind people often sign to get things over with, trusting that nothing is complicated. I had done that many times in my life, especially when the papers were brought by family. Back then, I didn't read every line. I skimmed, and I trusted. I began reading again from the beginning, one page at a time, one line at a time. Small print. Dry language, nothing that stood out unless you paid close attention. But the more I read, the more I slowed down, not because it was hard to understand, but because I realized I had overlooked far more than I thought. These weren't just medical documents as I had believed. They were authorization papers, granting decision-making power in situations where I might no longer be able to manage on my own, the authority to sign on my behalf, to manage, and to arrange. Everything was written very clearly, so clearly that I couldn't say I had been forced. I could only say that I hadn't read carefully. My hand rested on the table, colder than usual, but my mind was obvious. I didn't feel myself collapse. I didn't feel the need to blame anyone right then. I sat quietly for a while, letting what I had just read settle in. I remembered the day I signed those papers. I remembered the way my daughter spoke, gentle yet hurried. I remembered my own thoughts at the time, that helping my child a little wouldn't hurt, that in a family, trust is only natural. I didn't scold myself. I didn't deny the years that had passed. I had lived my whole life by that trust, and I don't consider it a mistake. It's just that, at this point, I understood something clearly. Trust, when not paired with awareness, can leave you vulnerable. I folded the papers, stacked them neatly, and set them aside. I knew this was the first time I was truly facing something that couldn't be taken lightly, but I sat up straight. I was still myself, and I knew that I needed to move forward with clarity, not with fear. It took me nearly 2 days to decide to call a lawyer. Not because I didn't know what to do, but because I needed to be sure I was doing it with a calm state of mind. I didn't want to act while my emotions were still unsteady. I had seen too many situations worsen simply because people rushed before they were truly ready. That morning, I left the house earlier than usual. The air was still cool. The familiar road suddenly felt longer. Along the way, I thought a great deal about my daughter, about when she was little, running around the house, asking endless, scattered questions. I remembered the times she leaned on me during difficult moments, trusting that her mother would always be on her side. For a brief moment, I asked myself whether meeting with a lawyer meant I was taking things too far, whether there might be a gentler way. It wasn't that I hadn't thought about our mother-daughter bond. On the contrary, it was precisely because I valued it that I felt the need to be clear. I stopped at a red light and watched people passing by. Everyone had somewhere to go. Everyone carried their own stories that others couldn't see. I realized then that what I was doing wasn't a confrontation. It was a confirmation, a way to confirm where I stood and what I needed to protect. When I walked into the lawyer's office, I wasn't as tense as I had imagined. I explained everything slowly, no embellishment, no excess emotion. I didn't use harsh words. I simply said that I had signed some documents without reading them carefully at the time, and now I wanted to understand them fully. The lawyer listened and then explained each point clearly and calmly. The more I listened, the more certain I felt that coming here had been the right decision, not to win against anyone, but to no longer be unclear with myself. I told him something I had been thinking ever since I left the house. I wasn't here to defeat anyone. I just needed to know where I stood. Saying it out loud lifted a great weight from my chest. I left the office at noon, the sunlight warm but gentle. I knew that from this point on, things would no longer be as simple as before. But I also knew I was holding on to the most important thing of all, clarity. And when the mind is steady, even complex steps will move in the right direction. I returned to the bank on a weekday morning. It wasn't crowded, it wasn't noisy. I chose that time because I knew I needed quiet, not to avoid anyone, but to be able to see everything clearly without distraction. The teller handed me a stack of statements. The pages were neatly clipped and arranged in chronological order. I took them, thanked her, and sat down on a chair near the window. The light was just right, not too harsh. I began to read, one page at a time. The numbers were blunt. They carried no emotion, no explanation. They were simply there, precisely as they were. I saw regular transfers, not large, but consistent, month after month. I paused for a moment, then continued. There were also small cash withdrawals, scattered, with no evident pattern. I didn't panic. My heart didn't race. Perhaps because I had already prepared myself. I knew that when matters are laid out in numbers, there is no room left for speculation. Everything becomes clear in a tranquil way. As I went through the pages, memories resurfaced. I remembered the times my daughter had called, saying she urgently needed money. I remembered her voice, worried, slightly embarrassed. I remembered how I hadn't asked many questions. I had simply thought that helping your child a little is only natural. We're family. When you're still able, you support each other. I remembered once writing a check late in the afternoon. I had hesitated for a few seconds, then signed it anyway. I told myself that money is meant to be used, and that if my children were stable, my mind would be at ease. Those thoughts were sincere at the time, and I don't deny them. But when the numbers sat side by side, I realized how thin the line is between helping and being placed in a passive position, not because of the amount of money involved, but because there were moments when I was no longer the one making the decisions. That realization made me stop. I folded the papers and placed them neatly into my bag. I wasn't angry. I didn't feel the need to blame anyone at that moment. I simply saw a truth standing quietly in front of me, clear, unforced, and not pushing me toward any extreme emotion. On the drive home, I drove more slowly than usual. I thought about the years I had lived, the choices I had made. I don't regret having helped my child. I only understand that from here on, I need to do things differently. The numbers had spoken, not to accuse anyone, but to remind me that it was time for me to stand in the right place, not so close that my vision blurs, and not so far that my heart turns cold. My daughter came by late one afternoon without calling ahead. I saw her car stop in front of the house through the kitchen window. I didn't rush to open the door. I turned off the stove, washed and dried my hands, and only then stepped out. Not to make things difficult, but because I wanted to be calm enough before we talked. When I opened the door, she was standing there. Familiar face, a small bag in her hand. She smiled, the same smile I had seen for decades. I invited her in, but instead of going to the living room as usual, we sat at the dining table. Yellow light. A space close enough for conversation, but not so intimate that we could avoid it. She began with the familiar questions, asking how I was feeling, whether I'd been tired lately. I answered slowly, briefly. I didn't interrupt. I let her finish. When she stopped, I spoke. I said that I had reviewed the documents. I said that I had checked the accounts. I spoke very slowly, one sentence at a time, without raising my voice. I didn't use words meant to hurt. I simply stated what I knew and what I had done to protect myself. She fell silent. The silence lasted longer than I had expected. I looked at her and realized that some things don't need to be argued. When the truth is laid out on the table, back and forth words only make things more tangled. She said she only wanted to help, that she worried about me, that I wasn't young anymore. I listened. I didn't deny that concern. I said just one thing, that helping does not mean making decisions for me, that caring does not mean crossing boundaries I had never given permission to cross. I told her that from now on, matters related to money and paperwork would be handled by me. If I needed help, I would ask. I didn't say it as a declaration. I said it the way one talks about the weather, calm and clear. For a moment, I saw a change in her eyes. It was no longer the familiar concern, but confusion mixed with discomfort. And in that moment, I understood something important. I cannot save someone if they refuse to stop, even if that person is my own child. The conversation ended sooner than I expected. There was no apology, no promises. When she stood up to leave, I walked her to the door. I didn't ask her to stay. I didn't close the door too quickly either. When the house grew quiet again, I sat down in my familiar chair. My heart didn't feel light right away, but it wasn't as heavy as before. I knew I had just set a boundary, not to create distance, but to stop hurting myself. After that conversation, my life didn't change dramatically. There were no prolonged arguments, no barrage of phone calls. Everything simply slowed down. And in that slowness, I began to see the rhythm of my own life more clearly. I still woke up early as I had for years. I made coffee, opened the windows to let in the sunlight, and watered the porch plants. These small routines helped me feel grounded. not to prove anything, but to remind myself that I was still capable of taking care of myself. I didn't initiate calls to my daughter, but I didn't avoid her messages either. When she checked in, I replied briefly, just enough, not cold and not drawn out. I understood that sometimes silence isn't distance, but a necessary pause to keep things from sliding further off course. Some afternoons, I walked around the neighborhood. I greeted neighbors, exchanged a few words, and then each went back home. These relationships weren't deep, but they were gentle. They didn't demand anything or stir up complicated emotions in me. I realized that at this stage of life, peace is far more valuable than trying to keep everything exactly as it once was. At times, my heart would still sink a little, not out of anger, but out of regret. Regret for how things might have been different. But I didn't let that feeling linger. I reminded myself that stepping back doesn't mean abandoning. Stepping back is a way to keep my inner world from being further unsettled. I spent time on things I had often set aside before. Reading more slowly, cooking more carefully, listening to an old song from beginning to end without doing anything else. These moments weren't grand, but they were enough to let me feel my own presence in this life. As my mind gradually settled, I understood something clearly. I cannot carry everything, nor can I take responsibility for other people's choices. My task at this stage is to preserve myself, to keep my clarity, to keep my heart free of resentment, and to keep the quiet space necessary for everything else to find its proper place on its own. Time passed quietly. There was no clear milestone to mark a new chapter, but I could feel the change through tiny things. I woke up in the mornings without that heaviness in my chest. At night, I went to bed without wondering what I needed to brace myself for the next day. My life became more streamlined, not because it lacked anything, but because I no longer let unnecessary matters crowd in. I ate more simply, cooked just enough. Cleaned within reason. I stopped holding on to things just in case, because I realized that very often those just in cases are what wear a person down. I took part in a few small activities around the neighborhood. Some days I helped organize books at the community library. Other days I simply sat and listened to others tell their stories. I didn't try to keep myself busy. I chose things that felt comfortable while doing them and left me light-hearted when they were done. From time to time, I thought about my child, not as often as before, but not with avoidance either. I knew she was living her own life with her own choices. I didn't follow closely. I didn't seek out more information, not because I didn't care, but because I had learned not to interfere in things beyond my reach. One afternoon, I sat by the window, watching sunlight spill across the yard. I suddenly realized that this quiet wasn't empty at all. It had its own rhythm, slow but steady, not overflowing with emotion, yet not lacking in connection. Everything was just enough for me to feel that I was living, not merely existing. I don't wish for everything to return to how it once was. I don't expect anyone to change because of me. I simply accept that everyone walks their own path. Some stretches run side by side, others branch off. What matters is that I no longer cling to what has reached the time to be let go, and in that letting go, I found a very real feeling. That at this stage, my life is moving in my own rhythm, unhurried, unskewed, and enough to bring me peace. Some mornings, I wake up very early, even before the day entirely breaks. Not because I can't sleep, but because my heart feels light, no longer pulled by familiar thoughts. I make a cup of coffee, open the window, and stand still for a moment, letting the morning air fill the house. I look back on the time that has passed, not to judge right or wrong, but simply to see how I moved through it. I don't deny the years I trusted, gave, and sacrificed. I don't regret them either, because without those years, I wouldn't be who I am today. I lived according to the understanding I had at each moment. That is enough. I didn't win against anyone. I don't think I lost either. I simply stopped at the right time when I realized that continuing in the same way would only exhaust me further. Some things, when you let them go, it's not because you've become weaker, but because you're strong enough to stop forcing yourself. That morning, I did something tiny. I tidied the shelf near the window where a few familiar potted plants sat. I wiped each leaf and turned the pots toward the sunlight. I had done these things many times in my life, but that day I did them with a different feeling. No hurry, no overthinking, just doing. I realized that freedom isn't about having more choices, but about shedding unnecessary restraints. Freedom is when you no longer have to explain to anyone why you need peace, when you no longer have to prove that you're right, when you no longer have to hold on to a role just to make others feel secure. I finished my coffee as the sunlight grew stronger. Before stepping outside, I paused for a moment, took a deep breath, then let it out slowly. I know the days ahead will still have imperfections. But I also know that I've learned how to move through them without hurting myself. And in that very ordinary moment, I felt free. Not loudly, not with anyone's approval, just free, in my own quiet way.